The question that we always ask ourselves is it relevant for runners? And does it help us achieve our bigger goal of ultimate ride? Will it help runners have a perfect run? Our target runner for this shoe is the core runner, and the core runner who's looking for a neutral, incredibly well cushioned ride. When we think about the core runner, we think about that runner who absolutely lives the run. The one thing that they'll plan the whole day around is making sure that they get out the door for a run. Now, if you think about the active runner, I'm still very serious about the sport, but if it's raining or there's a social engagement, the active runner will find a reason not to go. The core runner will make sure that their whole day is engineered around getting out for that run. They're absolutely addicted. The one thing that runners hate is when they find a shoe that they fall in love with, like runners have with the Vomero 3, then we go and change it. So one thing that runners everywhere hate. They want to be able to come back to a shoe and for us to improve it, but also for them to be able to recognise some key components that they feel safe with and that they trust. So on this shoe, the big thing that we've done is maintained the midsole and outsole. The guts of the shoe, the engine of the shoe, if you like, are exactly the same as the Vomero 3, and that to runners is a huge positive. Our obsession is with the foot. So we want to make sure that not only do we look at how the foot functions, but also the shape of the foot. If you look at the foot, this bone here, the calcaneus bone, is naturally rounded. That's to allow for a smoother landing during foot strike. So we've done exactly the same thing with this softer crash pad on the Vomero. On the women's shoe, we've actually radiused that a little more aggressively because you know that women need a little smoother landing. There's a lot of differences between male runners and female runners. You think of the average body weight of a female is typically 10 to 15% less than a male. So obviously how we engineer our cushioning systems, how we engineer certain support systems has to be different. The other thing that we notice, because there's a wider Q angle, so women have slightly wider hips, so the angle between the hip and the knee tends to be a little more exaggerated. They can need a little more support than men, so we also always try to think about that as we engineer our shoes. On the men's shoe, although we have an isolated crash pad, it's not quite as beveled as the women's shoe. That's because men have a higher body mass and typically can compress this area a little more effectively than women. So we don't isolate it quite as much, we don't bevel it quite as much, because we know that with that added pressure we're still going to get that smooth transition if we still have that isolated crash pad area. Also on the medial side of the shoe, just going back to that Q angle kind of comment that I made, we don't have the arch support in the male shoe. We have the CPU. We know CPU is a nice dynamic stretch material that offers great support and fit. On the women's shoe, we want to enhance that with the arch fit. On the men's, we know that CPU works just fine, so we go with CPU on the men's shoe. Also little things like the flex grooves up here on the forefoot. We want to make sure that we get a nice flexible shoe on the men's side, but we don't cut into the midsole quite as aggressively as we do on the women's side. The reason that we cut in aggressively on the women's shoe is because of the lower body weight. It takes a little bit more for them to flex the shoe. We know that if you're heavier, it's a little bit easier to flex that shoe. So we want to make the men's shoe appropriately flexible for men. So when we think about comfort, we always think about how we can make the shoe nice and breathable in the areas that need to be breathable. So in the vamp of the shoe, through the quarter, we've got this nice breathable mesh that feels great against the foot. In the areas that want to provide support, like in the heel area, we've got this gender-specific, in this case women-specific heel cradle, and that's to allow for the variance in heel shape between men and women. So we've used this gender-specific heel cradle in the women's shoe. Also on the women's shoe, we've got this arch strap support, which just allows for a more snug fit through the arch. We've also got the expand fit zone up in the forefoot here. The runners all over the world call the bunion ring. Who are we to argue? So we have this nice expandable zone in the forefoot, which allows for the variances in the female foot up there. You'll also notice we've got this injected CPU section on the lateral side of the shoe. That's just to allow for a more dynamic fit. So when the shoe's laced up, it absolutely conforms around the foot. So when runners are out on the road, the one enemy that they have is impact. So the amount of pressure that goes through the body during every foot strike. So if you think 2 to 3 times your body weight gets transferred through your skeletal system and your muscular system during every foot strike, over the course of a 5-mile run, it's typically about 3,500 strikes on the ground. If you run on asphalt or tarmac, that's a lot of pressure to absorb. So we know that the foot can absorb some pressure on its own, but we want to make sure that we amplify that and also negate the amount of impact that we know runners go through during every foot strike by providing incredible cushioning solutions. The Vomero 4 is a really good example of that.